TopMedTalk.
Nick Majerison here. Welcome to TopMedTalk. And on today's TopMedTalk, we're going to have a piece taken from the 20th Current Controversies in Anaesthesia and Perioperative Medicine Conference, held in Dingle by EBPOM. Don't forget, of course, you want more details on this podcast. Full show notes are available on topmedtalk.com. Have a listen.
It's a delight to welcome our first speaker, Ross Kerridge, who's an anaesthetist and associate professor in Newcastle, Australia. It's always an absolute joy listening to Ross's presentations, some of those warm and thoughtful presentations I think I've heard at Dingle and other conferences. I think it's fair to say Ross has probably been suggesting how we could or should do perioperative medicine for the best part of about 20 years, and I think other places are now finally starting to get the idea. But great pleasure to welcome Ross. Over to you.
Thanks for those words. That's very nice. You think, who? You're talking about me? I was reminded just before lunch of what's the connection with here. Now, in 1798, there was a little bit of a disturbance in Ireland. A few people with ideas about their future that weren't particularly liked by people in London, and so they won free trips to Australia as a result. And they settled in Sydney, or at least, well, they were placed in Sydney, and in 1804 decided to have another go in Sydney and had an uprising and marched on Toogoongabbie and burnt a few buildings. And eventually the soldiers rounded them up and strung up 7 of them. And they decided that these people were too dangerous in Sydney, and so they established a secondary point of incarceration 100 miles north in Newcastle in 1804. And so that's how my family has been associated with Newcastle for a long time. But anyway, so talking about perioperative medicine in Australia and the core issues, by which I mean clinical, organisational, research and education, and I'll deal with organisational things first. People talk about, well, what are the problems you have here and what problems does everyone else have? And sometimes you think everyone's talking in different languages and arguing, but one of the things that I've realised is while everyone is different, everyone is the same. And so we can always learn from other places, and these sessions are really good. But that said, every country's got important differences that you need to be aware of, and they may be economic, they may be in terms of the healthcare workforce, just cultural, financial, even subtle things like case mix and personalities and the histories of hospitals and so on. But we know comparing systems, and Liam Brennan showed this slide last night from the Commonwealth Fund, that overall the British health system is said to be number 1 in the advanced world, but Australia's number 2. But we do well on health outcomes, which surprises me, and what even more amazes me is administrative efficiency. We're number 1, which means everybody else is even worse. Oh boy, that's a worry. And on this one from the Bloomberg, the Australian system appears to be deteriorating, which may be true, I think. We spend about the same as everybody else. A few years ago it seemed to be a bit smaller because we were going through a mining boom that was, if you like, artificially inflating our GDP. But you know, we're about the same as everyone. But I think these graphs are all very well, but let's look at other things. I think here we are comparing, and this is comparing spending on ads. Yeah? And look at that. America spends $567 per person on advertising, and Australia ranks second in the world at $486. And in Australia leads the world in digital ad spend per internet user, a measure that is also rising quickly in the US. So isn't that interesting? And of course no one's worried about the rising spend on advertising because it's not out of the taxation budget, and so therefore it's not a problem, but it's still a waste of resources on things that just make people miserable or feel that they're ugly. So maybe we should worry about that. And when you go looking for financial graphs, you see things like this which show you that why so much money in the health budget is spent on people who have already retired. So all these ideas of developing health systems where people fund it out of their income and their savings is always doomed to fail, because most of our health expenditure is in the last 5 to 10 years of our life, which is a good thing. If you're rich, you want to spend more on staying alive and enjoying life. So the Australian healthcare system, comparing it to other countries, it's a highly fragmented system. We theoretically have universal free GP-based healthcare, by which I mean that we have the system that Britain and Ireland are familiar with, of GPs being a common gatekeeper to health. At least theoretically everyone has or should have their own GP, but they're not funded in Australia on a capitation basis. They're funded on a fee-for-service basis. So the GPs only actually get money when they're actually seeing someone in front of them. Whether they're doing any good by seeing them, doesn't matter. If they're seeing them, they can bill on a fee-for-service basis, and they bill the federal government. But once someone goes into hospital, if they're a public patient, they bill the state government. And so one of the really important things, particularly in administrative situations in Australia, is to work out ways of shifting tasks of healthcare from the hospital system onto the GPs, because that takes it out of the state budget and puts it on the federal budget. And this is called cost shifting, and the federal government is continually trying to watch that and minimise that or adjust it in budgets, and it's a game that goes on. We also have a very active private hospital sector. More than 60% of all surgery is done in the private sector, and that includes big surgery, cardiac, adult neurosurgery, and so on. The private hospital sector is increasingly dominated by a number of large medical corporations which own multiple hospitals, and some of them are very good in terms of the attention they pay to quality and their style of management. But sometimes when they sell a hospital, as has happened in my city, a hospital that was owned by one corporation is sold and taken over by another corporation, and the people who work there say, things have really changed, sometimes have really improved, and all of a sudden a whole lot of money is being invested into that hospital to raise its marketability and its position to the community and to the medical sector, and sometimes they deteriorate as a result. So there's an ongoing debate about fixing the health system and people coming up with answers and so on and so forth. So in some sectors and places it's very similar culturally to the NHS in Britain. In others it's very different. In terms of the medical workforce, many GPs are specialists, being fellows of the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, but any doctor in Australia can work in primary care, admittedly in what we call 24-hour medical centres, where they always will see people at a bulk billing rate, so they'll just accept the money that the federal government pays for seeing, and these centres are often owned by medical corporations, and the doctors are coached to focus on the things that generate money very quickly and meet them, greet them, treat them and street them, get them out the door very quickly. And in fact, the old-style GP, who I've always seen as the base rock of a good health system, are being undermined by these sorts of practices and by just general funding restriction. And they're politically, they don't have muscle that some specialist groups, including anaesthetists, do. In hospital, in private hospitals, specialists all work on a fee-for-service basis. So an anaesthetist will provide a service and send that bill to the patient, and then the patient will claim some of that bill back from their health insurer, but there's commonly a gap, and depending on where you are and the polite thing, you're told to use the Robinhood Principle. So if someone is clearly got a lot of money to spend, then you beef up your bill and put on a large gap. If they're someone who's struggled to pay their private health insurance fees over the years, then you just take the fee that the health insurer will pay and no gap the patient. Within public hospitals, you can be employed on a full-time salary, which is what I am, so I can be hoity-toity and moral and so on and so forth, or a part-time salaried specialist, or you can be employed on a sessional basis as a visiting medical officer, which is a different thing again. So again, lots of fragmentation. Good things, anaesthetists is a relatively high status specialty. All the med students want to get into anaesthetics. They're literally asking us in third and fourth year, what do I have to do to get onto the anaesthetics training program? The surgeons have become very subspecialised and procedure focused, and that backs onto us. And internal medicine has become very subspecialised, but in the last 5 years, there's been, if you like, a renaissance of general medicine. Now, and geriatrics, Jagdeep Desi is not here, but we've talked about this, that geriatrics in Australia has traditionally not focused on acute medicine. And so some of the things that Jagdeep was talking about with geriatricians getting involved in perioperative medicine would be difficult to enact in Australia, although there are some, including in my hospital, some very good people who have taken an interest in geriatrics, but of their own volition, interested in acute general medicine, and with the re-emergence of general medicine as being seen as a viable tertiary hospital discipline, which I think is a great thing. They're getting back into that. But that said, pragmatically, they have more than enough to do dealing with the acute medical patients, that they're not desperately searching for work other than in a few private hospitals in inner Melbourne, that they feel threatened by anaesthetists getting involved in perioperative medicine. The other thing is we've had a recent tsunami of local medical graduates. The same thing's happened here, but my understanding is that we're not going to see the effect in terms of number of medical graduates until about 8 years from now, I think it is, whereas we had a big politically motivated increase in the number of medical school places around 2004, which has come through as a big bump in number of medical graduates starting about 4 years ago. And this has induced, at times, almost a paranoia amongst the young doctors that they're not going to get jobs because there are so many more medical graduates coming out. I think that is overstated because I think they're grossly underestimating how many international medical graduates we're pulling in to staff our health system in Australia. At one stage, 50% of new doctors per year were international medical graduates. So we were under training to that extent. So I think we're probably overtraining a little bit now, but that will mean Australian graduates will go elsewhere, and a lot of Australian graduates now have fairly shallow roots in Australia. They've got cousins in other countries. Their parents came from other countries. They are not threatened at all by travelling around the world, and so I don't think it's such a dreadful thing as some of our young doctors are thinking. Okay, medical training, almost identical to Britain or Ireland. Our undergraduate programs are moving to graduate programs, giving an MD rather than a MBBS. It's really just a marketing tool, and the universities, always being centres of altruism, have noted the number of young doctors who are paranoid about their career prospects, and so have created master's programs that they'll charge about $25,000, $30,000 for, which give training in various topics, some of which are good and some are just there as a money-making opportunity, until I'm a bit cynical about some things. we have the same medical college structure, but there's the College of Anaesthetists, ANZCA, Australian New Zealand College of Anaesthetists, and then Australasian College of Physicians with multiple subspecialty societies, such as the Internal Medicine Society of Australia and New Zealand, which is the general medicine. We've got an Australian College of Emergency Medicine, which has been established for quite a long time now, about 35 years, I think, and seems to have much more of an established position than the equivalent college in Britain, I think, and I think we've got bigger numbers of FASMs, as we call them. There's the College of General Practitioners, and there's the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, which focuses more on GPs in rural and remote areas, as it would suggest. And importantly for this audience, there is a completely independent College of Intensive Care Medicine, and intensive care is recognised by the Federal Licensing Authority as a separate specialty. And there's a completely separate training program which includes 6 months of anaesthetics, but that is the only mandatory requirement, exposure for anaesthetics for intensivists. And many people going into intensive care come from, they may have had some time in medicine or in emergency medicine, but may have had very little exposure to the operating theatre environment. And that creates some interesting things. That said, the AMC has indicated that they are now becoming resistant to any more colleges and specialties. I think I think intensive care was the last new college, and I think there's a perception that that may have been not such a wise move, even at that level. So there are specialty lobby groups as well, or industrial groups, like the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, that take an interest in financial and political matters, whereas the college says, oh, we only deal with education. But in reality, there's and generally a pretty functional conversation between those two groups. So in terms of clinical things, we've talked about the perioperative system, and I think across the country it's been accepted now that that's the normal way of doing things. Historically, it was a great surprise to me, as I'm blowing my own trumpet as being in there early on, that many anaesthetists across the country took it up enthusiastically and went to their administrator saying, we've got something that can offer you improved outcomes and reduced money and will help you do it. And that was a really good thing for the specialty and raised our profile. But we've got chaos on the wards. And it's a perception, but we've got increasing evidence of systematic failures of care on the wards post-operatively. And it's the little things that go wrong. It's not the big things. As I say, if you have a head transplant, everyone knows, even the cleaners, even your neighbour, as you're going into hospital for a head transplant, will be telling you, oh, don't shake your head too vigorously because, you might rupture the sutures, and, everyone will be saying, oh, don't tell them any jokes. Everyone knows about that problem, which has only happened once in the whole history of head transplants. But they'll forget to give your antibiotics, they'll get your fluid management wrong. They won't write up DVT prophylaxis. They won't respond when you get a bit of atelectasis, and that's where things go wrong. And that's our challenge, I think. So are more ICU beds the answer to post-operative care? I think that's a very interesting debate, and we might come back to that in the discussion. There have been some interesting topics, papers written about perioperative medicine. Someone called Grocott wrote this one. And similarly in Australia, that people are getting the message that this whole thing of perioperative medicine is really important for the future of anaesthetics. In terms of research, I think that we punch pretty well in Australia for our numbers, although our numbers aren't all that small. That said, we have our heroes like Kate Leslie and Alicia Dennis and Dave Story and Ronaldo Bellomo, the king of them all, and of course Paul Miles, the genius. But there are many. But the thing that has really made a difference in Australia, and Paul has really, my admiration for him is immense. but we've fostered a culture of very much working together, and I suppose part of it is that there are very few people whose career or financial advancement depends on their research productivity, so it's an entirely and intellectually altruistic activity. But what's this leading into? Just a funny story. We had a meeting about perioperative research involving a number of people from all over the world, including a hotshot American whose name I can't remember. But we had this panel discussion about making multi-centre research work. And Dave Story was chairing it, and Kate Leslie was on the panel, and she said, look, the thing that's really made it work for us is that once a year all of those interested in research, we go up to Port Douglas, which is a sort of coastal beach resort, and we just, it's really relaxed, and we just hang about in t-shirt and thongs and get together, and it really builds teamwork. And Dave said to them, do you have anything like that? And he said, oh, right. No, I think I need to explain. In Australia, thongs aren't scanty underwear. They're things you wear on your feet. But it's a great image. A lot of anaesthetists in thongs. Anyway, so in terms of education, our specialist qualifications through ANSCA, Monash University has a short course in perioperative medicine and is providing a master's as well. The short course is extremely popular, or I won't say extremely popular, is most popular, it seems, with people who are 10 years post-fellowship, who are feeling that they want to get better at this, but are feeling a little bit lacking in confidence in some aspects of perioperative medicine. So that's interesting. There are some other things. There are a few places offering postgraduate fellows positions. And we have a symposium once a year, which this year is this one in October. Next year it will be in Brisbane. And it's a good meeting. We have about 450 registrants this year. About 60% anaesthetists, 30% physicians, a few surgeons. I'm one of the conveners, and we've been beating ourselves up for a long time about what can we do to get more surgeons involved. And the surgeons have come back to us and saying, look, thanks for the invite. We're very happy to be invited to speak or take part or whatever, but really this is your area, and you need to get on with it. And we want to focus on doing surgery. So it's been interesting having that feedback from the surgeons. TRIPOM has established in Australia, literally last month, a formal group of trainees with an interest in perioperative medicine has been established, allied with the group in Britain, and I think it's fantastic the work they're doing there, and we're really excited that they've established themselves. What is the college doing? And this is more for an Australian audience, and one of the college counsellor, or the counsellor with the lead on this, gave me these slides because we wanted to make sure that we got the message right. They have spent the last 3 years consulting with all the different stakeholder groups, the different colleges, plus government bodies, the insurers and others, advocacy groups. And essentially there are two options, and they're following both of them, so to speak. One is that we're going to increase the amount of perioperative medicine within the normal ANSCA fellowship curriculum, and that every ANSCA graduate will be a practitioner in perioperative medicine, but they're also developing a qualification with a curriculum, a volume of practice, CPD, but not a faculty. And these are for people who wish to be seen to be qualified as specialists in perioperative medicine, but that qualification, while it will be auspiced by the College of Anaesthetists, will be open to people with backgrounds in medicine or intensive care or surgery or emergency medicine or perhaps even general practice or rural and remote medicine. And as I say, while there will be a qualification, it is specifically not establishing a faculty. And there's been a lot of nervousness about this for some reasons that I've touched on. So in terms of the ANZCA curriculum, that's been worked through with much more detail, and you're not going to be able to read that, of course, but much more stuff that wasn't so much spelt out in previous manifestations of the normal FANZCA curriculum. But in terms of the perioperative medicine specialist, defining it as someone who is able to manage patients and procedural risk before, during and after surgery using evidence-based care and so on, with a CANSMED framework, and covering those particular areas in terms of medical expertise. That it will be auspiced by ANZCA, but multi-specialty entry and cross-training, and so part of it will be, if you're an anaesthetist, you need to go and be a medical registrar in probably acute general medicine for 6 months. And there will be generous grandfathering initially. A steering committee has been set up that's engaging with the fellows further, reviewing the literature, developing the curriculum further, developing clear models of care, and a formal health economic analysis. And a steering committee led by Vanessa Beavis, who is the current ANZCA Vice President, so will be the next President, but involving all the relevant colleges, and we've said with close high-level oversight of process, or colloquially, it's being watched like a cat watches a mouse. Or stakeholder engagement. So it could be said that this is what the steering committee meeting is like. So that's where we are now. Okay, thanks.
Nick Majerison here. Thanks for listening to TopMedTalk. Now, before we let you go, it's important that we remind you to subscribe to TopMedTalk. That way you'll never, ever miss another episode. Also, if we could encourage you to join us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, pretty much every single social media platform, we're there. Join us. And finally, check out TopMedTalk.com. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to email updates. That way we can always tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and how you can join us. TopMedTalk.com, and click on the section marked email updates. Finally, TopMedTalk is proud to act as the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about them as well. EBPOM.org is their website. That's EBPOM.org. And if you go to EBPOM.org/meetings, you can find out about some of the wonderful meetings that we attend and cover across the year here on TopMedTalk. That's EBPOM.org/meetings.